The Peak District, renowned for its rolling hills and expansive moorlands, offered a landscape both beautiful and haunting. As evening approached, the moors were cloaked in a mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself, lending an ethereal quality to the scenery. The heather-covered slopes, dotted with ancient stone outcrops, faded into the distance, their outlines softened by the gathering fog. James, a seasoned hiker in his late 30s, was intimately familiar with these trails. For years, he had wandered these paths, drawn by the solitude and the challenge they provided. The Peak District was more than just a place to him. It was a sanctuary, a space where the noise of everyday life could not reach. He cherished the silence, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustle of wind through the gorse. On this particular evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James felt a familiar calm settle over him. The fog was thicker than usual, giving the landscape an almost dreamlike quality. The world around him seemed to shrink, the boundaries defined by the limits of his sight. It was as if he had stepped into a realm apart from time and reality. As he trekked along the narrow path, his mind wandered. He thought about the legends associated with these lands, stories of ancient spirits and mythical creatures that had been passed down through generations. Though he considered himself a rational man, James couldn't help but feel a twinge of fascination with the idea of the supernatural. The moors, with their stark beauty and quiet desolation, seemed like the perfect backdrop for such tales. James paused for a moment, taking in the view. The fog was rolling in thicker now, curling around the stones and swallowing the distant hills. He took a deep breath, savoring the cool, damp air. It was then, out of the corner of his eye, that he noticed something unusual on the hill opposite him. A solitary figure, standing still against the twilight sky. The figure was cloaked in a dark robe, its hood pulled low over its face. It stood motionless, as if waiting for something or someone. James squinted, trying to make out more details, but the fog seemed to thicken around the figure, obscuring it from view. A shiver ran down James's spine. He had never encountered another person out here this late, especially not someone dressed in such a peculiar manner. Curiosity and a hint of unease spurred him forward, down the path that would take him closer to the mysterious figure. As he moved, he kept his eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had been. But the fog was relentless, swallowing the landscape in a blanket of white. When he reached the hill, there was no sign of the figure, only the mist swirling in the fading light. James stood still, listening. The moors were silent, save for the soft murmur of the wind. He glanced around, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. The fog was now so dense that he could barely see a few feet ahead. He shook his head, chiding himself for letting his imagination run wild. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, or his eyes playing games in the fog. Yet, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something, or someone, out there. Determined to make sense of the encounter, James resolved to explore further, unaware that this decision would lead him deeper into a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. James continued his trek, the figure's image lingering in his mind. The fog clung to the landscape, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. The sense of isolation deepened, each step echoing in the silence that enveloped the moors. His path wound up the hill where he had seen the cloaked figure, his curiosity driving him forward despite the creeping unease. As he reached the crest, he scanned the area, hoping to spot the figure again. The mist was so thick now that visibility was reduced to mere feet. Shadows loomed and shifted in the periphery, tricks of light and fog playing on his senses. But there was no sign of the mysterious figure. James stood still, straining to hear any sounds beyond the muffled whispers of the wind. The stillness was oppressive, the kind that makes one hyper-aware of their surroundings. It felt as though the moors were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Just as he was about to turn back, dismissing the encounter as a figment of his imagination, a sudden gust of wind parted the fog for a brief moment. There, not too far from where he stood, James caught a fleeting glimpse of the figure again. It was closer this time, standing near a cluster of rocks, its outline barely visible through the haze. The figure was clad in a long, dark robe that seemed to absorb the light, rendering it almost featureless. The hood obscured its face, adding to the eerie, spectral appearance. James felt a chill run down his spine, not just from the cold, but from a growing sense of unease. Who could this person be, standing alone in such a desolate place, dressed in such an unusual manner? He called out, his voice sounding strange and hollow in the fog. "Hello? Are you all right?" There was no response, only the wind rustling through the gorse. The figure remained still, its silence more unsettling than any reply might have been. James took a tentative step forward, but as he did, the figure seemed to retreat, gliding backward into the mist without a sound. It was as if the fog itself swallowed it whole, leaving no trace behind. James stood frozen, grappling with the surreal nature of what he had just witnessed. The rational part of his mind struggled to make sense of the situation. Perhaps it was another hiker, someone playing a prank, or maybe even an actor preparing for a local play, although such an explanation felt weak given the circumstances. As the fog closed in again, James felt an inexplicable compulsion to follow. The figure's presence stirred something deep within him, an urge to understand, to uncover the truth behind this strange encounter. He moved towards the spot where the figure had disappeared, the silence around him amplifying the sound of his footsteps. But when he arrived, there was nothing. No sign of the figure or any indication that anyone had been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, the fog swirling in quiet defiance of his search. James looked around, frustration and confusion mingling with the unease that had settled in his gut. The moors, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien and foreboding. James decided to head back, the encounter leaving him with more questions than answers. As he turned to leave, a distant sound reached his ears, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. It was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving James with the unsettling feeling that he was being watched. Determined not to let his imagination get the best of him, he hurried back down the path, all the while casting glances over his shoulder. The fog seemed to close in tighter around him, pressing down with a heavy, oppressive weight. The encounter with the figure, though brief and inexplicable, left a mark on James. As he made his way back, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had glimpsed something beyond the ordinary, something that defied rational explanation. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a series of events that would challenge his understanding of reality and the world he thought he knew so well. James's footsteps quickened as he descended the hill, the path ahead barely visible through the thickening fog. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, had taken on a sinister quality. The air was heavy with moisture, carrying with it a chill that seeped into his bones. The unsettling encounter with the hooded figure played over in his mind, raising more questions than answers. As he rounded a bend in the trail, something caught his eye: marks on the rocks lining the path. He stopped and knelt down to get a closer look. The stones bore strange, intricate carvings, symbols he didn't recognize. They were arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, their lines sharp and deep in the ancient stone. James traced one with his finger, feeling the roughness of the carving, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. These weren't natural formations. Someone had etched them into the rocks. The symbols seemed old, their meaning lost to time, but they conveyed an aura of something ancient and forgotten. James had heard stories of pagan rituals and old legends tied to the moors, tales passed down through generations that spoke of spirits and ancient rites. He had always dismissed them as folklore, stories to entertain or scare children. Yet, here they were, physical manifestations of those tales, staring back at him. A sudden sound broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic whispering that seemed to come from all around him. It was barely audible, blending with the wind, yet distinctly unnatural. James stood up, scanning the fog-shrouded landscape, trying to pinpoint the source. The whispers seemed to ebb and flow, a chorus of soft voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They were both near and far, a disorienting effect that made him feel surrounded. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with an eerie cadence. James's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape whatever was happening here. The fog pressed in, the world shrinking to the space around him, and the symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As he turned to continue down the path, the whispers suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The abruptness of it was jarring, like a door slamming shut. The quiet was oppressive, the kind that made every sound seem magnified, every movement fraught with significance. James quickened his pace, eager to put distance between himself and the unsettling symbols. But as he moved, he noticed something even more disturbing. Additional symbols, similar to the ones he had just seen, began to appear more frequently along the path. They were etched into trees, carved into the earth, and painted onto stones, all leading in the direction he was heading. A cold realization dawned on him. These symbols were not random. They were guiding him, leading him somewhere specific. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He was no longer sure if he was walking towards safety or deeper into danger. James's mind raced, torn between the desire to solve this strange mystery and the primal urge to flee. The path, once a comforting guide through the wilderness, now felt like a corridor leading to an unknown fate. He had always believed in rational explanations, in the solidity of the natural world, but this experience was shaking that belief to its core. As he continued, he noticed that the fog was thinning slightly, revealing the faint outline of a structure in the distance. His curiosity piqued. James pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. The whispers had ceased, but the silence felt charged with anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The structure grew clearer as he approached. An old, abandoned chapel, its stone walls weathered and covered in ivy. It stood alone on a small rise, a relic of a bygone era. James felt a pull towards it, a sense that this place held answers to the mysteries he had encountered. He hesitated at the entrance, peering into the dark interior. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of damp stone and decay. He stepped in, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through broken stained glass windows. The interior was empty, save for a few rotting pews and an altar at the far end. The space felt heavy with history, as if it had witnessed events long forgotten by the world. As James moved further in, he felt the temperature drop, the air around him becoming colder. His breath misted in the air, each exhale a visible reminder of the chill. He approached the altar, drawn by a strange compulsion, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the chapel. It was then that he saw it. Standing near the altar, the hooded figure, its back turned to him. The figure was still, as if in deep contemplation or prayer. James froze, his heart racing. The figure made no sound, its presence almost ghostly in the dim light. Gathering his courage, James took a step closer. As he did, the figure turned slowly, revealing its face, or rather, the absence of one. The hood fell back slightly, and James saw that the figure had no features, no eyes, nose, or mouth. It was a blank, smooth surface, like a mask that hadn't been finished. Panic surged through him, and for a moment, he was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure raised a hand, pointing towards him, a silent gesture that felt like an accusation or a summons. The air around James seemed to thicken, pressing in on him, making it hard to breathe. He knew he had to leave, had to escape this place before it was too late. With a surge of adrenaline, he turned and fled, running back the way he had come, his footsteps echoing in the empty chapel. As he burst out into the open, the fog greeted him like an old friend, enveloping him in its cold embrace. James ran, the landscape a blur around him, driven by fear and the urgent need to put as much distance as possible between himself and the chapel. The moors, once a place of solace, now felt like a trap, the fog a living thing that sought to ensnare him. He didn't stop until he reached the base of the hill, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked back, but the chapel was hidden from view, swallowed by the mist. The whispers had ceased, and the symbols were no longer visible, but the memory of the figure and its faceless visage was etched into his mind. James knew that what he had seen was beyond explanation, a brush with something otherworldly that defied rational thought. As he made his way back to the village, his steps slow and heavy, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had changed him, marked him in some intangible way. The world around him seemed different now, the familiar landscape charged with a new and unsettling energy. He was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't, his sense of reality shaken by the night's events. All he knew was that he had come face to face with something beyond his understanding, and the experience had left a deep, indelible mark on his soul. The moors had always been a place of mystery and legend, but now, for James, they held a darker, more personal meaning. The figure, the symbols, and the whispers were all part of a larger puzzle, one that he felt compelled to solve, even as it terrified him. As he reached the edge of the village, the fog began to lift, revealing the familiar shapes of houses and streets. The world of the ordinary reasserted itself, but the memory of the encounter lingered, a shadow that would follow him for a long time to come. James knew that he would never see the moors the same way again, and that a part of him would always be drawn back to the mysteries they held, no matter how frightening they might be. James's return to the village did little to quell the disquiet that had settled in his mind. The familiar sights and sounds of everyday life felt distant, almost unreal, compared to the chilling events of the moors. He couldn't shake the memory of the faceless figure or the eerie symbols, each recollection sending a fresh wave of unease through him. Determined to make sense of what he had experienced, James decided to seek out more information. He remembered the local historian, Mr. Carter, a retired teacher known for his extensive knowledge of the area's folklore and history. If anyone could provide insight into the strange occurrences, it would be him. The following morning, James made his way to Mr. Carter's cottage, a quaint stone house nestled at the edge of the village. The air was crisp, the sky clear, a stark contrast to the previous night's fog. As he approached, he rehearsed how he would explain his encounter without sounding irrational or overly alarmed. Mr. Carter welcomed him in, offering a warm cup of tea. The older man listened intently as James recounted the events, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When James finished, Mr. Carter sat in thoughtful silence for a moment before speaking. "The symbols you described," he began, "sound like the old pagan markings. They're rare but not unheard of in these parts. The Peak District has a long history, much of it predating written records. Some of these symbols are believed to be linked to ancient rituals, perhaps even sacrifices made to appease the spirits of the land." James felt a chill at the word, sacrifices. He had hoped for a more mundane explanation, but Mr. Carter's words only deepened the mystery. "And the figure?" he asked, hesitant. "The one without a face." Mr. Carter's gaze sharpened, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "There are legends," he said slowly, "of a ghostly monk, cursed to wander the moors for eternity. Some say he was part of a forbidden ritual, others that he was punished for breaking sacred vows. The details vary, but the essence remains. He's a restless spirit, seeking something, or perhaps trying to communicate a warning." James felt a shiver run down his spine. The story seemed to align disturbingly well with what he had seen. "Do you believe in these legends?" he asked, more to gauge Mr. Carter's opinion than anything else. The historian shrugged. "Belief is a tricky thing. I've seen enough in my years to keep an open mind. The moors are old, far older than we can imagine, and they hold secrets we may never fully understand. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the fact remains that people have experienced strange things out there." As they continued to talk, James couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter on the moors was part of something larger, something ancient and unexplained. The more he thought about it, the more he felt drawn to uncovering the truth, despite the fear that gnawed at him. Mr. Carter advised caution, warning that some mysteries are better left unsolved. "The moors have a way of holding on to their secrets," he said, "and those who seek them out sometimes find more than they bargained for." Despite the warning, James felt a compulsion to return. He thanked Mr. Carter for his time and left the cottage, his mind a swirl of thoughts and questions. The village, usually a place of comfort, now felt like a mere prelude to the vast, untamed moors beyond. As he walked back to his home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the ground, James pondered his next move. He was torn between a desire for safety and the lure of the unknown, the latter growing stronger with each passing moment. The Moors called to him, whispering promises of answers and revelations, but also hinting at dangers unseen. That night, as he lay in bed, James replayed the events over and over in his mind. The figure, the symbols, the whispers, all seemed to weave together into a tapestry of mystery that demanded to be unraveled. He knew that to find peace, he would need to confront whatever lurked on the moors, even if it meant facing his deepest fears. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of foggy landscapes and faceless figures. In the quiet of the night, James resolved to return to the moors, to seek out the chapel and the secrets it held. The journey ahead filled him with both dread and anticipation, the two emotions mingling in a way that felt almost intoxicating. As dawn broke, casting the world in soft hues of pink and gold, James prepared himself for what lay ahead. The moors awaited, their mysteries as thick as the fog that so often shrouded them. And James, driven by a need for answers, was ready to step into the unknown once more, determined to face whatever truths he might uncover. The following day, James set out early, determined to return to the chapel. The morning was clear, with only a light mist lingering over the moors, a stark contrast to the previous day's dense fog. He packed his bag with a few essentials, including a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook. His plan was to document whatever he found, to have tangible evidence of the strange occurrences. As he made his way back to the moors, the landscape seemed to stretch out endlessly before him, a vast expanse of rolling hills and rugged terrain. The path was familiar, yet each step felt weighted with the knowledge of what he might encounter. The memory of the hooded figure and the eerie symbols lingered in his mind, fueling a mix of fear and curiosity. The hike to the chapel was uneventful, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional call of a bird. As James approached the hill where the chapel stood, the air grew colder, a chill that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. He paused at the base of the hill, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves before beginning the climb. The chapel loomed ahead, its outline stark against the pale sky. As James drew closer, he noticed the same strange symbols etched into the stone walls, similar to those he had seen on the rocks. They seemed older, more worn, as if they had been there for centuries. The sight filled him with a sense of foreboding, a feeling that whatever he was about to face was not of this world. He reached the entrance, the wooden door hanging ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. With a final glance at the mist-covered moors below, James stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay, and his footsteps echoed in the empty space. The chapel's interior was dimly lit by the weak sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows, casting distorted patterns on the stone floor. James moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. He approached the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. The memory of the faceless figure was vivid, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. As he reached the altar, James noticed something new. A set of candles arranged in a circle, their wicks blackened as if recently extinguished. In the center of the circle lay an old book, its cover worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the years in his hands. The text was in a language he didn't recognize, filled with symbols and illustrations that mirrored those on the chapel walls. James carefully placed the book in his bag, feeling a surge of determination. He had found something tangible, something that might provide answers. As he turned to leave, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic chanting, barely audible, as if coming from far away. He froze, listening intently. The chanting grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. He looked towards the source of the sound and saw it, the hooded figure, standing in the shadows at the far end of the chapel. The figure was motionless, its presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. James felt rooted to the spot, unable to move as the chanting continued, each word sending a shiver down his spine. The figure raised its head, and James caught a glimpse of the blank, featureless face beneath the hood. Panic surged through him, breaking the spell that had held him in place. He turned and ran, the chanting following him like a dark echo. He burst out of the chapel, the daylight blinding after the dim interior. James ran down the hill, his heart racing, the landscape a blur around him. The chanting faded, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his footsteps. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the moors, the village visible in the distance. He paused to catch his breath, glancing back at the chapel now shrouded in mist. The encounter had left him shaken, but he felt a strange sense of relief mixed with fear. He had something concrete, something he could show to others, proof that what he had experienced was real. As he made his way back to the village, James couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was far from over. The book in his bag felt like a weight, a reminder of the mysteries still unsolved. He knew he had to understand what he had seen and what it meant, even if it meant facing the darkness that lurked on the moors. The chapel, the symbols, the chanting. They were all pieces of a puzzle that James was now determined to solve, no matter the cost. Returning to the village, James felt a mix of relief and urgency. The book he had found at the chapel was a tangible link to the mysterious events, and he was eager to delve into its contents. Once home, he carefully opened the book, feeling a sense of reverence for the ancient artifact. The pages were filled with symbols and text in an unknown language, interspersed with illustrations depicting rituals and hooded figures similar to the one he had encountered. The symbols and illustrations felt like fragments of a forgotten history, pieces of a story that had somehow endured through the ages. James couldn't decipher the text, but the images alone were enough to send a chill down his spine. One illustration showed a hooded figure standing before an altar, surrounded by what appeared to be ethereal forms, perhaps spirits or souls. Another depicted a circle of figures, hands raised in what looked like a ceremonial gesture, the symbols around them glowing with an eerie light. As he pored over the book, a sense of dread settled over him. The ritualistic nature of the illustrations, combined with the chanting he had heard, suggested something far darker and more malevolent than he had initially imagined. He realized that the figure he had seen was not just an apparition, but possibly a remnant of an ancient ritual or curse tied to the land. Determined to uncover more, James decided to seek out additional help. He remembered a university in the nearby city that had a reputable archaeology department. Perhaps there, he could find someone who could translate the text or provide context for the symbols and illustrations. With the book safely packed, he set out the next day, the need for answers driving him forward. At the university, he met with Dr. Evelyn Hart, a professor specializing in ancient languages and cultures. She listened attentively as James recounted his experiences and showed her the book. Dr. Hart's eyes widened with interest as she examined the ancient text, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the pages. "This is remarkable," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "These symbols are a form of Old English runes, combined with elements from various ancient European languages. It's not something I've seen before, at least not in this combination. The text seems to reference some sort of ritual or ceremony, possibly linked to pagan practices." James felt a surge of validation. His experiences were not just figments of his imagination. They were connected to a deeper, historical reality. "Can you translate any of it?" he asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Dr. Hart nodded slowly. "It will take some time, but I can try." The illustrations suggest a ritualistic aspect, possibly involving a figure like the one you described. This might be a form of ancient lore or a curse meant to trap a spirit or entity in the area. As she spoke, James's mind raced. The figure, the symbols, the chapel, all were part of an intricate tapestry of mystery that spanned centuries. He felt a mix of fear and fascination, a compulsion to delve deeper despite the potential dangers. Over the next few days, Dr. Hart worked diligently on translating the text, providing James with updates on her findings. The book spoke of a guardian of the moors, a spirit bound to the land, cursed to wander for eternity. This guardian was once a monk who, according to legend, broke sacred vows and was punished by the gods or spirits of the land. The ritualistic symbols and chanting were part of a binding spell meant to keep the guardian contained, preventing it from unleashing chaos. The revelation was both illuminating and terrifying. The figure James had seen was not just a ghost but a cursed entity, tied to an ancient and powerful ritual. The faceless aspect symbolized the loss of identity and humanity, a punishment for the monk's transgressions. The book suggested that the Guardian's power could be renewed or diminished by reenacting the ritual or disrupting it. James's mind raced with the implications. The symbols he had seen on the moors, the chanting in the chapel. These were signs that the ritual was still active, perhaps even gaining strength. The thought of what might happen if the Guardian's power were fully unleashed filled him with dread. Determined to prevent any potential disaster, James and Dr. Hart discussed possible actions. They considered contacting local authorities or historians who might be familiar with similar legends. However, they realized that the supernatural nature of the events would likely be dismissed or misunderstood. James knew he had to return to the chapel to confront the Guardian once more. This time, he would be prepared, armed with knowledge and a plan. The thought of facing the faceless figure again terrified him, but he felt a responsibility to prevent whatever dark forces were at play from spreading further. As the day of reckoning approached, James prepared himself mentally and physically. He gathered supplies, including the book, which he believed could be crucial in countering the Guardian's power. The words of Dr. Hart echoed in his mind. Sometimes, understanding the past is the key to changing the future. With a heavy heart and a determined spirit, James set out for the moors, knowing that the journey ahead would test his courage and resolve. The mist was already beginning to gather as he approached the familiar trail, the landscape both welcoming and foreboding. He knew that this encounter would be different, that the stakes were higher, and the dangers more real. As he ascended the hill towards the chapel, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened, as if the land itself was responding to the impending confrontation. James felt a presence, a subtle but undeniable awareness that he was not alone. The whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. The chapel loomed ahead, its stone walls dark against the foggy sky. James felt his pulse quicken, his body tense with anticipation. He reached the entrance, pausing for a moment to gather his strength. The chanting had resumed, louder and more intense, as if calling to him. James stepped inside, the cold air wrapping around him like a shroud. The interior was as he remembered, the candles still arranged in a circle, the altar standing silent and foreboding. The hooded figure was there, waiting, its presence filling the space with an oppressive energy. The figure turned, revealing its faceless visage once more. James felt a surge of fear but stood his ground, holding up the book as if it could shield him from the entity's power. The chanting grew louder, the air vibrating with the force of the words. James opened the book, his hands shaking, and began to read aloud the translated passages, the words feeling strange and powerful on his tongue. As he spoke, the figure seemed to hesitate, the chanting faltering. James continued, his voice growing stronger, infused with a desperate determination. The air around them crackled with energy, the symbols on the walls glowing with a strange light. The figure reached out, as if trying to grasp something, its faceless head tilting in an almost pleading gesture. James felt a rush of emotions, fear, pity, determination, all mingling in a chaotic swirl. As he finished the passage, the chapel was filled with a blinding light, a burst of energy that sent James reeling. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a profound silence. When James opened his eyes, the figure was gone, the chapel empty save for him and the lingering echo of the ritual. James stood in the silence, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was still, the oppressive energy dissipated, leaving behind a sense of calm. He felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness, the weight of what had transpired settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew that the Guardian had been bound once more, the ritual renewed. The danger was not entirely gone, but the immediate threat had been averted. As he left the chapel, James felt a deep sense of respect for the land and its ancient mysteries. The moors, with their beauty and danger, were a place of power, a place where the past and present intertwined in ways that defied easy understanding. James returned to the village, the book and its secrets in tow. He knew that his journey was far from over, that the moors still held many mysteries yet to be uncovered. But for now, he felt a sense of peace, a recognition of the importance of respecting the unknown, of acknowledging the power of the land and its stories. As he walked through the village streets, the sun breaking through the clouds, James felt a connection to the place he had never felt before. The moors were part of him now, their secrets a part of his own story, and he knew that, whatever the future held, he would be ready to face it, armed with the knowledge and experience he had gained. The moors, with their whispers and shadows, had become a place of revelation, a place where James had faced his fears and emerged stronger. He looked back at the hills, shrouded in mist, and felt a sense of closure. The Guardian's story was one of many, a reminder that the past lives on in ways we might never fully understand. As he reached his home, James felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had undertaken, for the challenges he had faced and overcome. The moors had tested him, had revealed their secrets, and in doing so, had shown him the strength within himself. The story of the Phantom of the Peak District was one he would carry with him always, a testament to the power of belief, the strength of the human spirit, and the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of understanding. And as he closed the door behind him, James knew that he was ready for whatever the future might bring, the lessons of the moors forever etched into his soul. James felt the weight of his recent experiences pressing down on him, but the urgency of the situation propelled him forward. The ritual he had performed seemed to have had an effect, but there was no way to be certain if it was enough to contain the Guardian, or if it had merely been a temporary measure. The mysterious energy that had filled the chapel lingered in his mind, leaving him with a lingering sense of unease. Determined to put more distance between himself and the chapel, James continued his journey back to the village. As he moved through the mist-covered moors, the landscape felt both familiar and alien. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was unnerving, as if the land itself was holding its breath. James's thoughts were a whirl of questions and doubts. Had he truly managed to bind the Guardian again? Or had he simply stirred something deeper, something more dangerous? The faceless figure's pleading gesture haunted him, filling him with a sense of dread and uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more to the ancient curse that bound the Guardian to the moors. As he reached a familiar crossroads, James paused to catch his breath. The fog had thinned, revealing the path ahead with greater clarity. He took a moment to orient himself, using the landmarks he knew so well. The village was not far now, and the thought of returning to the safety and warmth of his home filled him with a renewed sense of determination. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath his feet. James froze, his heart pounding. The air around him felt charged with energy, and the ground seemed to vibrate with a low, menacing hum. He glanced around, searching for the source of the sound, but saw nothing but the mist and the dark outlines of rocks and gorse. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to break free from the earth itself. James felt a surge of panic, his instinct screaming at him to run. He turned and sprinted down the path, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. As he ran, the growling sound faded, replaced by a cacophony of whispers and rustling leaves. It was as if the moors themselves were alive, watching his every move. The landscape seemed to shift and change around him, the mist swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. James pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort, his mind focused on one goal: escape. The path ahead widened, and James saw the familiar outline of the village in the distance. The sight filled him with a surge of hope and relief. He could see the rooftops, the warm glow of lights in the windows, and the comforting shapes of people going about their lives. It was a beacon of normalcy in the midst of the chaos and fear that had consumed him. James reached the edge of the village and slowed to a stop, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked back at the moors, now shrouded in darkness as the sun set behind the hills. The air was still, the whispers and growls gone, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant sound of birds settling in for the night. He knew that the experience had changed him, that the Moors and their secrets would forever be a part of his life. The encounter with the Guardian, the ancient curse, and the rituals had opened his eyes to a world beyond the ordinary, a world where legends and reality intertwined in ways he had never imagined. James walked through the village, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He had survived the encounter, but he knew that the story was far from over. The Guardian's presence, the ancient curse, and the mysteries of the Moors were threads in a tapestry that stretched far beyond his understanding. He felt a responsibility to uncover the truth, to protect others from the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the land. As he approached his home, James felt a sense of peace wash over him. The familiar sights and sounds of the village, the warmth of the lights, and the comfort of knowing he was surrounded by people gave him a momentary reprieve from the fear and uncertainty that had gripped him. He entered his home, locking the door behind him, and sank into a chair, exhausted but alive. The book lay on the table, a silent reminder of the journey he had undertaken and the mysteries still unsolved. James knew he would continue his quest for answers, driven by a need to understand and a desire to protect. For now, he allowed himself a moment of rest, a moment to gather his strength for the challenges that lay ahead. The Moors, with their secrets and shadows, were still out there, waiting. But James was ready, prepared to face whatever the future might bring, armed with the knowledge and experience he had gained. The night was quiet, the village peaceful. But James knew that beneath the surface, the ancient mysteries of the Moors still lingered, waiting to be uncovered. And he, now a part of that story, would continue to seek the truth, no matter how deep or dark the path might lead. The days following his escape from the Moors were a blur for James. The village resumed its quiet, uneventful pace, but for him, life had irrevocably changed. He carried with him the weight of his experiences, the faceless figure, the eerie rituals, and the knowledge that something ancient and powerful lurked just beyond the familiar hills. James spent his time poring over the book he had recovered from the chapel, working closely with Dr. Hart to decipher its secrets. They discovered that the book detailed not just the curse of the Guardian, but also a history of the land, intertwining folklore with actual historical events. The Guardian, once a monk, had been a part of a religious sect that practiced rituals to bind malevolent spirits, sacrificing their own freedom to protect the land. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the rituals described were meant to maintain a delicate balance between the physical world and the spiritual one. The faceless figure was not just a guardian, but also a warning, a remnant of a time when the boundaries between the worlds were more fluid. The book suggested that disrupting these rituals could have unintended consequences, potentially awakening other forces best left undisturbed. The villagers, largely unaware of the depth of James's experiences, noticed a change in him. He was more reserved, his usual warmth tempered by a distant, contemplative air. When asked about his time on the Moors, he would speak only in vague terms, unwilling to share the full extent of what he had encountered. He knew that the truth would be met with skepticism or, worse, fear, and he felt a responsibility to protect his neighbors from the knowledge that haunted him. One evening, as James and Dr. Hart sat together, reviewing their notes and translations, Dr. Hart looked at him with a serious expression. "You know, James, we might never fully understand what you encountered out there. Some things defy explanation, existing beyond our comprehension." James nodded, a heavy sense of acceptance settling over him. "I know, but it's important to try, isn't it? To understand, even if it means facing things we'd rather not." Dr. Hart smiled sadly. "Yes, it is, but we must also be careful. The past has a way of reaching into the present, and some mysteries are better left alone." James understood the warning in her words. The book, with its ancient knowledge and dark rituals, was a key to secrets that had been buried for a reason. He felt the weight of responsibility, not just for his safety, but for that of the entire village. The Guardian's curse was contained, but the potential for its resurgence lingered, a shadow over the peaceful countryside. As the days turned into weeks, James found himself drawn back to the Moors, not to seek out the chapel or the Guardian, but to simply walk the paths, to reconnect with the land that had been both a source of solace and terror. He found a strange comfort in the familiarity of the landscape, in the way the mist rolled over the hills, in the silence that felt less oppressive and more contemplative. He began to see the moors differently, not just as a place of danger but as a living entity with its own stories and secrets. The Guardian, once a frightening apparition, was now a part of that story, a reminder of the land's ancient and complex history. James realized that he had become a part of that history, a guardian in his own right, tasked with remembering and respecting the past. In time, the urgency of the mystery faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. James continued his research, always careful to respect the boundaries of what should and should not be uncovered. The book remained a source of fascination and dread, a link to a world that existed on the fringes of human understanding. He shared his findings with Dr. Hart and a select few who he trusted to appreciate the significance without seeking to exploit it. Together, they formed a small circle of guardians, dedicated to preserving the balance that the rituals had been designed to maintain. They understood that their role was not to dominate or control, but to observe and protect, to ensure that the delicate equilibrium between worlds remained undisturbed. As the seasons changed, James felt a sense of peace returning. The fear that had gripped him began to loosen its hold, replaced by a deeper understanding and respect for the mysteries of the world. He knew that the moors would always hold a place of significance for him, a place where he had faced his fears and emerged stronger. And so, life continued in the village, the moors a constant presence in the background, their secrets whispering in the wind. James knew that the story of the Phantom of the Peak District was far from over, but he felt ready to face whatever came next, with the support of his friends and the knowledge he had gained. He would remain vigilant, a silent guardian of the land's history and its future, forever changed by the experiences that had brought him closer to understanding the true nature of the world and his place within it. As time passed, James found a new rhythm in his life, blending the ordinary with the extraordinary experiences he had encountered. The village returned to its peaceful routine, but for James, the lessons from the moors remained ever present. He continued to study the book, refining his understanding of the rituals and the history they encapsulated, while also deepening his connection with the land. Despite the calm, James couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with the Guardian had left a mark on him. It wasn't a physical mark, but something more profound, a shift in his perception of reality. He felt more attuned to the subtleties of the world around him, noticing the play of shadows, the rustling of leaves, and the whispers of the wind with a heightened awareness. It was as if the veil between the seen and unseen had thinned, allowing glimpses into a reality that most people remained blissfully unaware of. This heightened awareness brought both clarity and burden. James became increasingly sensitive to the energy of places and people, picking up on emotions and tensions that others might miss. He found solace in this new understanding, but also felt a growing sense of responsibility. The knowledge he carried was a double-edged sword, empowering yet isolating, enlightening yet heavy. He shared some of these experiences with Dr. Hart, who listened with a mix of fascination and concern. "You've become a kind of keeper of the old ways," she observed one day. "Not just in the scholarly sense, but in a more spiritual way. It's as if the land has chosen you to bear witness." James nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He had indeed become a caretaker of the moors' secrets, tasked with preserving the delicate balance between the past and present, the mundane and the mystical. This role was not one he had sought, but it was one he had come to accept, understanding that his encounter had changed him in ways that were irreversible. One evening, as James sat by his window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade over the hills, he felt a familiar sensation. A subtle tug at his consciousness, a whisper at the edge of hearing. It was the same feeling he had experienced on the moors, a presence that seemed to call to him. He knew that the Guardian's mark was not just a one-time encounter, but an ongoing connection to the land and its history. Determined to understand more, James returned to the moors, this time not as an explorer seeking answers, but as a pilgrim honoring a sacred site. He walked the familiar paths, feeling the earth beneath his feet, the wind against his skin, the landscape alive with its own energy. The moors had always been a place of mystery, but now they felt like an extension of himself, a living entity with which he shared a deep bond. As he approached the chapel, James felt a wave of calm wash over him. The building stood silent, unchanged, a sentinel of the past. He entered, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The altar was bare, the candles long extinguished, but the air was thick with the weight of history and memory. James stood before the altar, closing his eyes and letting the silence envelop him. He felt the presence of the Guardian, not as a threat, but as a part of the land's fabric, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. The figure's faceless visage, once a source of fear, now seemed a symbol of the unknown. The mysteries that lie beyond human understanding, always present, always watching. In that moment of reflection, James felt a deep sense of peace. He realized that the mark left by the encounter was not a curse but a gift, a reminder of the fragility of the world and the need to respect the forces that shape it. The Guardian's presence was a call to remember the past, to honor the traditions that had kept the balance, and to be mindful of the consequences of forgetting. As he left the chapel and made his way back down the hill, James felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The mark of the encounter was a part of him now, a guiding presence that would shape his actions and decisions. He knew that his role as a guardian was not one of active intervention but of quiet stewardship, a commitment to preserving the knowledge and traditions that had been entrusted to him. Back in the village, life continued as always, the rhythms of daily existence flowing like the river that wound through the valley. But for James, every day was touched by the awareness of the deeper realities that lay just beneath the surface. He carried the wisdom of the moors with him, a quiet strength that informed his every step. James continued to work with Dr. Hart and the small group of like-minded individuals who had come to share his understanding of the land's significance. Together, they formed a community of guardians, dedicated to preserving the stories and rituals that connected them to the past. They knew that the world was changing, that the pressures of modern life threatened to erase the delicate balance. But they also knew that their role was to bear witness, to remember, and to protect. As the years passed, James found a sense of fulfillment in his new role. He had become a bridge between worlds, a keeper of the old ways, a guardian of the unseen. The encounters with the Moors and the Guardian had marked him, but they had also given him a deeper understanding of his place in the world. The story of the Phantom of the Peak District remained a part of him, a testament to the power of belief and the mysteries of the land. It was a story he would carry with him always, a reminder that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. And so, James's life continued, shaped by the encounters and the knowledge he had gained. He walked the paths of the moors with reverence, knowing that the land and its stories were a gift, a legacy to be cherished and protected. The Guardian's mark was a part of him, a symbol of his connection to the land and the mysteries it held. James knew that he would never fully understand the depths of the moors or the forces that shaped them, but he also knew that understanding was not the goal. The true purpose was to honor the mysteries, to respect the unknown, and to live in harmony with the land and its history. And in this, he found a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that came from knowing his place in the world and the role he was meant to play. If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.